Next speaker is Mark Smith, who is the director of the Eastern U.S. Freshwater Program for the Nature Conservancy. His experience with the United States EPA and at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Environmental Affairs has contributed significantly to his expertise in U.S. water policy. His talk addresses the difficulties involved with integrating protection of freshwater resources and their associated biodiversity with national water management policies in a world where freshwater resource levels are perilously low. Mr. Smith.
All right, well, thank you, and I'd like to thank the steering committee and Doug for inviting me to come down and be part of this great conference. I really enjoyed every talk here, and Doug, we've had a chance to work in a number of different forums together, and so you have a great asset here at Connecticut College with Doug, and I'm sure your other faculty as well. As my introduction said, I work for the Nature Conservancy. For those of you who don't know, the Nature Conservancy, our mission is to protect the plants, animals, and natural communities of life that represent the life on Earth by protecting the lands and water they need to survive. So we're very much focused on protecting the environment. But we understand to do that, it's really all about people. Probably like a lot of you, particularly the students here in your environmental certificate program, you're doing it because you love nature like I do. But what you find out is that it's really all about the people, and so that's what I'm going to talk to you today about. I'm a political science person by training and got a degree in environmental policy, and so I'm going to talk about how do we get to places, how did Connecticut get to where they are, where they have what I call a modern water management approach, where their laws and their objectives are to really focus on striking that right balance, and what does it take to get there. Let's talk a little bit. I think Peter yesterday kept mentioning a soft landing, and so I'm going to try to sort of describe what I've seen as being a soft landing of how do we actually make progress on these very tough issues. I'm also, if there's time, going to talk a little bit about some of the science. Luckily, Lee and yesterday Glenn sort of gave a lot of the background so I can speed through it, but some of the really cutting-edge science, some of the new tools we have today that we didn't have 10 or 15 years ago that really allow us to strike this balance and to be much finer in our ability to make these decisions. And then a little bit about conservation and also some new approaches there. I guess I'm going to start by just doing a little bit of, I don't have to show many pictures of what we like our water resources to look like, and we've seen more than enough pictures of dry streams, not just from New England, around the world you can get pictures like this at conferences when you talk about stream flow issues and quantity issues. We haven't seen many of these, but this was from the drought in 2002, and these are dry reservoirs. So when there's low water conditions, it's not that they just affect the environment, but it really affects our water supply. And it's this joint management of the environment and the human uses together that are really sort of the nexus of what this conference is about, both that scarcity, which is very real, and those conflicts, which can be very real. But I'm really going to focus on a more positive note about resolving those conflicts and how it's often that ability to work together on these problems and that the outcomes of conflicts that really allow new progress to be made. And so I'm going to sort of jump to my conclusion, just so in case you're not paying attention in 20 minutes when I'm done, which is really that I looked at a number of case studies from around the country and a little bit around the world, and really what happened is when people get together to focus on these issues, the outcome, even though what ended up with very strong environmental protection, the outcome was almost always about addressing a larger societal issue. And I think it's that broader view that brings in a broader group of people and answers a much bigger question than just the environment or even just what the people need. And some examples of that are going to sort of show how we end up with progressive laws that really force us to answer the right questions. So let me see if I can get this to work here. I'm just going to spend a minute on the issue. You've seen hydrographs before where there's flow on this side and the months across the year. But I think one of the challenges and what I find intellectually interesting is that it is the natural variability of flow. And we put together this slide for the Savannah River, but about how nature has really evolved itself around this disturbance regime, around these different flow needs. So you've already heard that in the high flows that salmon and other fish, you need those high flows to get up to their spawning grounds. They come in from the ocean and they go upstream. They lay their eggs, and then those high flows, as they're receding, as they go down, the flows move those eggs downstream, and they settle onto appropriate habitat. But it's not just the fish in the river. You have all the riparian forest and the floodplain trees who their germination, and they drop their seeds either in the time of water so that they get dispersed downstream, or during the dry times of the year so that they can take root and grow up and have a seedling in place before the next flood comes so it doesn't get drowned. So their whole timing of the cycle of their reproduction is tied to these variable flows, not just keeping some water in the stream, but some of these big floods, the whole variability of the entire hydrograph. And then, of course, it's even the birds and the migratory birds, and when they come back and they nest, and often you'll have birds that will nest in trees during the flooding season because that's the time when the raccoons can't climb up the tree and steal the eggs out of the nest, and so they need those environments. So they've been successful in their evolution because of these natural cycles. And I think that's really challenging from a human management standpoint because you have to manage to a moving target. You don't want the same outcome all the time. You want that natural variability. And so it's very difficult to sort of do technically, and I think Lee showed an approach of how they're really trying to tackle a very difficult problem from a straight sort of science or math or policy perspective, and I think that's why I like the issue so much, because it is a challenge. So I'm going to talk a little bit about modern water policies, what I call modern water policies, and my definition is really one that does explicitly try to strike this balance of protecting biodiversity and meeting human needs together, and some innovations about what have come out of what people have put in place. As someone who works on policy, I've spent most of my career actually in government, not working for a non-governmental organization. I found it's extremely important what our laws say. Laws are the reflection of our societal values, what we've agreed to jointly, particularly in a democracy, as to the outcomes that we want. And so while it's very important that we get the rules right and the operating rules right, we have to actually make sure we're trying to answer the right question. What's the goals of our laws? What are we trying to do? And how do we make sure that those are right? The example I use is the Clean Water Act, a wonderful law that we're still trying to get right. We haven't solved all our problems, but it had the right goal, which is fishable. All waters of the U.S. should be fishable and swimmable, and have biological, chemical, and physical integrity. So we can work from now forever to make sure we achieve those goals, and it has sent us on the right direction. We're still making progress, and that's really important. So as a policy person, that's what I really look to. So unfortunately, as a policy person, we're going to now read some laws together. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to start with South Africa. I guess before I go into the example, well, let me see how I'm doing this. Let me show you South Africa's national water law that came about in 1998. And the purpose is to ensure the nation's water resources are protected, used, developed, conserved, and managed and controlled in a way that take into account meeting basic human needs. We heard a lot about this yesterday, the right for water for humans, promoting equitable access to water, and protecting aquatic and associated ecosystems and their biodiversity and their ecological biodiversity. The water law in South Africa is viewed as probably the most modern, most progressive law on this issue. It's very recent. It's only 10 years old or 11 now. It goes into defining a reserve quantity of water. It actually reserves by right water to satisfy basic human needs. We heard about that as a goal yesterday. South Africa has it in their constitution, in their laws, as a right to the basic, and that's just basically your water to eat and drink and survive. It's not to water your lawn or fill your pool, but basic human needs is a right in South Africa. And they have a reserve for the environment. So at the most fundamental level of their law, they have protected both the human right and the ecological right. It's really a remarkable outcome. I won't go into how it's even great, it provides maintenance, protection, and rehabilitation. It talks about all the things that us environmentalists want to look at. But the real question is, how did they end up here? How did they end up about the law so progressive? And, when I got into this, I said, man, they must have some great environmentalists down there that really pushed it, which they did. But what I found out when I talked to some of them was that the issue that drove this issue was not the environment. It was an equity issue. Because South Africa, of course, in 1997 or 96, the apartheid ended after many decades of struggle about its most basic human rights. And so equity of access to resources for all the people of South Africa was the issue, and that included water. So you say, okay, well that's great, Mark. That explains why we have a water right for humans, because that's what it was all about. Half the people had no right to their basic water rights. But what about the environment? So I think that's what's really was interesting, where they understood that, Africa, and then this is from the Zambezi River, has a diverse system that really, a natural system that depends on these rivers and these floodwaters, not just the fish, but some charismatic species. But more importantly, they have communities that depend on these systems for their livelihoods. You really have a large population that depends on subsistence livelihoods to meet their basic needs. So if you didn't have a healthy ecosystem, a big part of the population couldn't meet their basic needs. So they needed to have a healthy ecosystem, not just in its own right because it's nice to have, but because that was the equitable access that people needed. They needed access to those resources. And it was that larger issue that really brought this most modern, in my mind, most progressive law into place. Really a remarkable achievement and a great example. Now they're struggling, and we're going to get to the science, because that doesn't mean just because you say you want to do it doesn't mean you've done what Lee's done and figured out all the rules, so they're still working hard, but it's driven some of the best science to come out, some of the most progressive thinking, because they're trying to answer the right question. And of course they have big issues where they also have big dams that are affecting their flood regimes, and a lot of those the fisheries and those species depend on sort of a full natural regime like I explained. So I think that's really, again, this idea that looking at finding, when people come together on different sides, they end up working on some larger issue that really moves the most progressive policies forward. So let's come a little closer to home in Florida. They also have a very strong water quantity issue, set of laws in Florida, probably the strongest in the country, very progressive, and they're building big new water supply systems like offline reservoirs like this, or desalinization plants like this. Really investing huge amounts of money into their water infrastructure in a way that also meets environmental flow goals. So let's look at their law. And this is what the legislature said, that there needs to be sufficient water available for existing and future uses that avoids the adverse effects of competition that requires from competition. They're very worried about the competition for water in Florida, which is, if you stop to think about it, why is that? Well, Florida is one of the fastest growing states in the country. They were just booming, and they don't have a lot of surface water supplies. They get a fair amount of rain, but they don't have a lot of natural storage. And so they were really worried about this conflict. So what they did, which I think is really innovative, is they have very strict what they call minimum flows and levels, but it's basically environmental water quantity standards. But what they said was, as we ask people to come into compliance, we're going to direct our funding to building projects that you'll see under number 1, that the highest priority project that you can get money for from the state or from these regional water districts is to help implement a minimum flow policy. So their money is tied not just to meet their booming demand, but it's tied first person in line is the person who's trying to meet that demand and meet their environmental flow goal and reduce some of their ocean outfalls, which was a question we just had about Long Island Sound. And so they've really structured a law here that actually puts the money and the driving. They were trying to solve the issue of competition for water. We have to build more supply. We need to build more infrastructure. There's a lot of people coming here, and that was the issue they were trying to solve. They weren't trying to solve just by itself the flow issue or just the demand issue. They tackled it. They came up with an innovation. They have real money there. Their water districts have big money, so they can build those huge projects. And so it's really driving some of the right solutions. Again, because in my mind, they structured the law right and the governor's committee that put together this came up with these innovative solutions. We'll go out west, another one. I don't think about the West being very progressive on water, as we heard about prior appropriation yesterday, but Montana has done something very interesting. Out west, they will actually close basins. When all the water has been appropriated to different uses, they will close that basin and say no more uses. But there was a loophole where in groundwater wasn't really under that law, under that closure in Montana. And so it created this uncertainty in the legal status of groundwater versus prior appropriation. And that's the other thing I found that really drives that's one of the conflicts people want to resolve, is uncertainty. The worst, people just don't like uncertainty. They'd rather know what's coming out. So they have now a law that requires a mitigation plan to offset your groundwater withdrawal. If you want to take out more groundwater from a closed basin, you have to have a plan to re-infiltrate that water that will avoid or offset any adverse impact. So that's actually very progressive, and that's really talking about a lot of what Lee was talking about. If we're going to have to use some water, how do we minimize that impact? I won't go through Connecticut. It's another example, but again, Lee's already gone through it. Again, it was to provide that certainty of a structure and a way to meet both, and he talked about the balance right in the law, another progressive one. I'll just end with Michigan, not to go into it because I really want to talk about Michigan, about their science, because again, by having the right law in place, it drives the right science to answer these very tough questions that I talked about early. And so Michigan passed a new law just last summer that there can be no individual or cumulative adverse impacts on a water resource, and the law is quite specific, and this is more like a reg, but they actually say, and they have a whole list of 11 different types of streams, but you can't have more than a 3% impact on fish communities. And I'm going to show you how they did that. But again, the conflict there was again a conflict between water rights of groundwater and surface water. There was a law case that was resolved in a way that put that whole legal framework into uncertainty, and what they really wanted was certainty. The other thing that changed was, Michigan has a lot of water. It's a big trout fishing state. And the industry, after sitting around the table for a year or so, said, we don't want to be the bad guys. We're in these communities. It's important to us. We don't want to be accused of drying up these streams. Just tell us where we should go. We want to build good projects. Tell us how to build good projects. And that was the issue they tried to solve. Where do we want our water uses to be so that we can avoid these adverse impacts? So that's going to make me shift gears into modern water science. I really want to touch on this because this is sort of cutting-edge work. And again, Lee set it up perfectly, so I don't have to explain a lot of detail to you. But these are tough questions. We don't know enough about these natural systems to know how they're going to respond. We do know when we kill them because we dry them up and they're dead, so we get that part. But where along the spectrum, how much can you change these systems and not have an acceptable impact or have an unacceptable impact is really key. So again, I explained all of this to you. Lee luckily spread this biological condition gradient where you have really pristine streams, you have mostly maintained streams, and you have really altered streams as you have, more. This is basically more withdrawal. I have an easier slide from Michigan that someone put together. Lee sort of glossed over this, but this is relatively new. We've done this on water quality, but we haven't done for water quantity. In Michigan, they came up with a classification system where they could divide all their streams up into, actually there are 11 types, but if you count, it's a grid of 4 by 3 here. There's an empty one. There are no large cold rivers. But basically, different rules for different streams, which means you have to be able to tell these streams apart. What's a cold water stream, what's a warm water stream, and what's a transitional stream. And from a scientific standpoint, because it's all a gradient, that is not an easy question to solve. But they were able to do that in Michigan and put every stream into one of those categories. A huge amount of work, but it's technically very sound. It's been reviewed by outside peer reviews, but a really important step. But this is the type of work we need to be doing. We haven't been doing. We've been doing it on water quality. We have not been doing it except in little pieces now on flow issues. And I won't go into this, but it's all based on fish, and fish like certain flows. Glenn yesterday gave a great talk about habitat curves, but they really can look statistically at where fish like to be during which seasons. And then this is sort of that same graph. You can look here. This is the same graph. This is a lot of water in the stream, and we drying up the stream. And when you have a lot of water up here, so if you're up in this corner, you have happy fish. And if you have no water, you have dead fish. This is a bioconditional gradient. This was done by one of our policy people for the legislature. I think it's quite clear. But you end up, what they were able to do, though, is really draw this curve. Because they had a lot of fish data and they could do the science and they classified their stream, they were able to draw this curve based on real data, not hypothetical data, figure out what those characteristic species were. And then what they did, you saw that 3%, they can say, okay, we're willing to live with a 10% decline in the number of fish species. So that's just going to be, that's going to not be considered an adverse impact. That's going to be okay with us. It's sort of within the realm. And so if you do that, you can say, well, how much water can I take to avoid an adverse impact? So basically, if I'm in here, I can take this much water and I won't have an adverse impact. And if I start taking this much water, I expect to have an adverse impact. This is the cutting-edge science because they know something about the ecology, they know how it's going to respond, and they can make management decisions based on real science. It's really remarkable, actually, and it's really the work of the future. And then, so that's sort of how you make that decision. And what they did you remember that graph that looked like playing tic-tac-toe with one too many lines? Well, they could draw lines specific to each of those classifications. So in their law, they regulate differently. You can see these lines. How much water can you take from this stream? Well, a cold transitional, you can't take very much before it turns warm and you change your fish species. But other rivers, you can really take a lot more of that water with relatively little change. This is the type of management that we sort of think really makes sense, that puts that finer point on how much water can you take, can be a much more specific answer based on location and what we know and our view of what the future looks like and what those laws envision, even though the legislators may not know it. This is the modern science that I think is really exciting, that we need to do more of, but is extremely difficult because nature is so variable. So do I have I have 5 minutes? Okay, let's see. I know I talk fast. Let me take a breath. Whew, I don't keel over here. So the last thing I'm just going to talk about briefly is actually a non-governmental approach, but it really reflects that same theme of cooperation, trying to avoid conflicts and finding that soft landing that Peter talked about, or that soft way to the future. And it's the idea of water efficiency and really looking much more comprehensively at how we use water. So this idea of water footprinting. How much water does it take to do the stuff we want? I think it was talked yesterday, like we don't really want water for its own right, except for a little bit to drink or shower. We really want water to grow food. Well, it takes 19 gallons. Let's talk about something that most college students, even though you're not old enough to drink, know something about. It takes 19 gallons of water to make 1 glass of beer. So, I mean, it's well worth it, but that's a lot of water. More importantly, it takes over 1,800 gallons of water to make 1 pound of beef. And so you really get a sense of how much water it takes and so you start looking at these industries it's sort of like a life cycle water look at these various ideas. And the idea is you can put standards on that. There are ways to do this more efficiently and less efficiency. And let's build a system of standards by which we can understand what it means to be efficient, to produce an efficient pound of beef, or to look at other food sources, or really understand our mix. And this is a chart from just sort of looking at this globally. I won't go into this because I don't have much time. But this is sort of the blue, our cereal and roots, sort of your basic vegetables. Oils and vegetable oils are here. And this is the CWRF is the water required for each food group, the basic water requirement per capita. And then if you look at animal products, how much more water. So I'm not a vegetarian, but this is rather, whether you're an animal rights person or not, it's this type of issue of how much more resources go into producing an animal product food source than your basic cereals and other food sources that really give you a sense of, well, what is our water footprint when we live our daily lives, and where do we really look for water to save when we're trying to be smart about it. So recently a number of environmental groups and professional associations have come together. It's just forming now, the Alliance for Water Stewardship, and it's really including this Pacific Institute, with Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, and others, to really sort of develop a certification program. I don't have time to go into it, but there have been very successful efforts on forest certification, green lumber. This tree has come from a sustainably harvested forest. And that's the idea of this Alliance for Water Stewardship. International standards for water use. We know that water producers are generally excellent stewards of water resources. They have a big interest in this as well. They're at the table. American Water Works Association is a big part of this effort. And basically, the goals are to do what we all want: sustainable water, that society and environmental beneficial, that recognizes basic human uses. Really, let's put water in that context of how do we make it a larger issue, understand our water footprint, and then put some standards about what the best practices are. So again, I won't go into it, but it's just starting now. There's been conferences around the world, a lot of interest. The standards are not yet developed. But it's this idea of people coming together on a professional basis saying, how do we really attack this problem? How do we make progress? This won't be the only answer. We need government. We need the full range of responses. But this is, again, a new idea on conservation of how do we really sort of look very big picture about how we address these issues. So I think I'm just going to wind up with a few comments that I think, this is an exciting field. I enjoy it because it is a challenge every day to work on these issues, and exciting. There is progress being made. I'm very optimistic, and it's really about that we develop the tools, the technology, and use our smarts to answer these questions. But in particular, I'm very interested in making sure that we frame the right questions, we set the right objectives, we build the right tools, and we make the right decisions. And that's what all these pieces come together. I think it's such a wonderful conference because of that. You're really hearing everything from the economics to the engineering to the biology to the regulation to the policy. It's a wonderful conference that I really think is talking about the cutting-edge issue but one that's really both, it is I think both a crisis, but I think it's also a great opportunity, and so I'm excited to sort of share a few of my views with you. So thank you very much.